But it doesn't feel to me like it was preordained that somebody like, Senator Elizabeth Warren would be anti-crypto. Like if you actually think about, sort of disintermediating the big banks, giving individuals more control, et cetera. Like to me, it's like there could have been a different version of the universe in which like Elizabeth Warren was a massive degen, right? Like, am I wrong about that? Like, it's not clear to me. Like, that was the CFPB was like, the big banks are like hurting the little guy. We need to give power to the people, etc.
This is a foundational transformation we see happening in the economy.
DeFi and blockchain are redefining business, the economy, and our society. Welcome to another episode of Redefined. I'm your co-host, Jeremy Allman, alongside my awesome friend and co-host, Megan Guy. What's up this week, Megan?
Really happy to be here, and I'm super, super excited to be here with today's guest. Zoe Weinberg is with us. She's the founder and general partner of Exante, which is a VC firm that recently was launched that's focused on agentic tech, which we'll get much more into as we get into the show today. But super psyched to be here. So Zoe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? It's not every day that we get to have someone to chat with on the pod whose work has taken them from, the front line of presidential campaigns to, the front lines of Iraq, and now to being kind of at the leading edge of some really interesting stuff in the venture world. So tell us a little bit more about how you kind of came up with the idea for Exante and what's brought you here.
Thanks, Megan. And thank you to both of you for having me on the show. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I have a fairly unusual background among folks in the venture world. I've been in investing for a long time, essentially straight out of undergrad. Had always been really, really interested in international development and national security and foreign policy. And so it was a very sort of natural jump for me to work at the World Bank. I was at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector investment arm of the World Bank, and ended up doing a lot of deals and work in conflict zones, as you sort of alluded to, Megan. Ended up spending time in places like Mogadishu and Somalia and Juba and South Sudan and DRC. I then later on worked as an aid worker in Iraq during the period in which Iraqi forces were retaking the city of Mosul from ISIS. And, I became totally fascinated with all the ways in which technology was being used in conflict, both on the battlefield itself, but also, the ways in which groups were often subject to a lot of surveillance and manipulation and oppression via technology, but also all of the many ways that people were leveraging technology to exercise freedom, right? Whether it was private communications, or the example I sometimes give is mining Bitcoin. I got to know some Bitcoin miners in Iraq, and I think they really opened my eyes to the ways in which there could be real financial freedoms attained by using permissionless blockchain. And so I felt like I was seeing both sides of that. It was really fascinating to me. I never thought that I would find a way to translate that into a venture fund, but that was what originally sparked the interest.
Amazing. What I loved the first time we met and we kind of started chatting about this, I love that you had a non-traditional background, because I think, as we chatted about a little bit, like that's part of what got me interested in this space. And I love the idea of folks thinking about technology, not just for its own sake or for the sake of building a big business, but really how it can help people and transform our societies, and thinking about that from all the different sides. So awesome to have you here. I know, for Jeremy, that's a key driver too. And we love those conversations on this show.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I really appreciate, that your perspective would be really fun is so many people look at things like Bitcoin and blockchain and sort of emerging technology from the first world where everything is safe and relatively secure. right? But where you see the most growth in these places are often where the system is broken, whether it's a broken financial system, massive rampant inflation, whether it's authoritarianism, where folks are trying to, avoid government surveillance, or just otherwise some level of oppression. And so, I've personally seen it in a bunch of areas in Central America that's been widely growing in things like Bitcoin. Zoe, you've been on the front lines in all kinds of places. I'd love if you maybe could share a story or some area where you're seeing the most impact at kind of, let's call it the frontier zone, where technology is actually, sort of pushing back a little bit of a quiet revolution against these sort of authoritarian areas.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, I really could not agree with you more that oftentimes the best innovation really comes from the places in which people have to be resourceful. And it's not just a question of experimenting with tech for the sake of innovation, but really out of like serious and acute need. So, for example, I have had the real privilege of getting to know, some developers who are working on new VPN technology in places like Iran, where, it really is sometimes a life or death situation, and the stakes are extremely high. I talked to an entrepreneur a while ago who's building in the circumvention space, who had grown up in mainland China, and he was very quick to say, I'm an expert in this because I've been building circumvention tools since I was 8 years old, to play games on the internet, right? And I think that's like often where a lot of innovation comes from. And to your point on blockchain related technologies too, I think this sort of need for a store of value and a currency that is outside of the potential risks that come with any sort of government controlled form of currency is huge. The way that this often comes up in the course of our investing and in the context of the fund is that people often assume that privacy tech is sort of like a nice to have, and that consumers say they care about privacy, but like they actually care about convenience and all that stuff. And I actually don't disagree with that. I think it's true. I think it's really hard to build privacy tech tools in the consumer space that people really want to pay for. But I also think it's really easy to take for granted when you live in a relatively mature and stable democracy, where you're like, is anyone reading my text messages? Like, I don't know, maybe. Like, do I care? Like, I don't know. Like the calculus is just different. And I think
nobody cares about my cat gifs or whatever.
Right, but I think that's the answer that most people have is like, who cares if anyone's reading my Gmail? Like, they're just going to see that I like signed up for a Berries membership, like whatever, and they don't care. And I and part of me is like, you should have enormous gratitude that you don't have to care, right? That you live in a place where you feel secure enough that it sort of feels like a whatever. And yet there are so many people in so many corners of the world for whom that is not the case, right? And for whom being able to communicate securely or transact securely, et cetera, is a huge challenge. And where if their private data were to be revealed, they could potentially be at real sort of serious risk. So I think it's always helpful to kind of like check ourselves and be like, well, privacy might feel like a nice to have here, but like in other places it's not, right?
Totally. As an investor, though, how do you think about those different markets, as you're evaluating a technology? Are you seeing things most often that are interesting to you bubble up, like you said, from the developers who are working in conflict zones and trying, in a life or death way to solve these problems? Or are you seeing tech, that's emerging maybe in the US or in places that, have had much greater access to resources to build and invest and hire for these sorts of things that then gets translated across to emerging economies?
Yeah, it is really a little bit of both. Megan, you mentioned agentic tech, which is the sort of the category of investment and innovation that we are really focused on helping to, sort of seed and advance in the world. We define agentic tech as technology that helps to support human agency. And that means individual rights and control over things like your privacy, your data, your assets, the information you consume. And, it's not a term that I made up. I learned it from some folks who are in the sort of privacy researcher and advocacy space who have been using it for a while. But I think it really does, it sort of captures the essence of what we're interested in. And so that is actually defined quite broadly. My general rule of thumb is like, yeah, if it's a tool that gives users the ability to have more control, then it's probably headed in the right direction. And so that can include cybersecurity related tools, that could include digital identity, that could include things in the crypto and Web3 space, that could also include, things like deepfake detection. So it's actually, relatively broad. In this, we're on fund one. It's early days here. In this first fund, our focus for the most part will be on US based companies, in part because we're a small team, and that is where the bulk of our relationships and networks are, and so forth. I really believe as an investor, you have to be humble about your ability to source where you can source the most high caliber deals, and I think I would be fooling myself to believe that I would be able to source the best quality pre-seed deals in Brazil if I have nobody on the ground there and I don't have deep networks there. So this fund will probably be overweight US, but it is totally consistent from a philosophy perspective for it to be a very global mandate. And my hope over time is that as we grow and have a bigger footprint, et cetera, it can be an even more global fund.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about that, right, as an investor, you're thinking about sort of arbitraging opportunity where you see things before someone else does. And even if the fund is maybe a US mandated fund in the early days, the global opportunity shows you what's going on maybe in an early way in other areas. So I think one of the more interesting things about Bitcoin and blockchain and sort of financial independence is you don't think you need it until you do, right? So, I think a great kind of story that came out, it's not an easy story, but, I have friends who were in Eastern Ukraine. They had to pick up and move like immediately. Like life was normal. They were working at a tech company and then life was not normal and they became refugees. And, in a time gone by, you literally, the only thing you would do is maybe grab what you could, put it in your backpack in, I don't know, whatever belongings you could, and you lose everything. And I have a number of friends whose story was instead of that, they actually were able to have a passphrase from their Bitcoin, and they were able to actually keep their belongings and keep some level of independence as a refugee moving from their location. And that story has been replicated in China. It's been replicated over and over again for refugee statements. And for many of them, they felt like, life was super normal. The financial system worked just fine until it didn't, right? And so, how do you think about emerging opportunities where you go, well, in the US even, whether it's VPN systems or whether it's Bitcoin and blockchain, what you might see in some other country actually has broader applications than just being in the frontier market.
For sure. And look, for the most part, we are looking for opportunities that do have a very broad application in the market and can be, leveraged for lots of different use cases. And actually, to your point, Jeremy, some of the companies we invest in may be US-based companies, but they're very much operating globally and they're being used by a very global user base. Any company that's focused on something like decentralized storage, like an IPFS and Filecoin or an Arweave, you can use decentralized storage for tons of different enterprise and consumer use cases, but it's also been used in certain cases by protesters in Hong Kong to upload copies of their publications and media before it can be censored by Beijing. The nature of decentralized storage is that it's extremely censorship resistant, right? And yet the companies, at least as far as I know, are not specifically going after like the activist market. And frankly, I don't think they should because that's a very small TAM. But like the nature of how the product is built lends itself to those uses as well. And that's often what I really like to see is like, it might not be designed specifically for folks who are living under authoritarian regimes, but the nature of how it's built maybe makes it quite useful for those purposes.
One thing I think is always really interesting as you think about, this category of agentic tech and, the trade-offs between privacy and transparency really is oftentimes I think what happens in tech is some innovation is launched and, makes its way out in the world and finds use cases that weren't necessarily those that the founders originally intended. And sometimes those are wonderful use cases, like the ones you guys have just shared. And sometimes they're pretty, nefarious. Actually, I kind of love this story. A friend of mine years ago worked at Palantir. And you guys might remember I think it was right before they went public, a couple years before that, maybe. They had all kinds of protests about the fact that their, data mining and analytics technology was being used to inform the U.S., the government drone system and potentially targeted killings and things like that. And I remember my friend saying, yeah, my mom called me this morning and she just wanted to give me a heads up that she was going to be protesting outside my offices today. And I think, it's a great example because there are so many wonderful use cases, of how data mining and analytics and connectivity and things like that have enabled us to create much better outcomes, bring more people security, safety, et cetera. But you never know who's going to use it, right? Or what position the government even that you're selling to is going to take. That can change certainly also as regimes shift. A lot of people that, maybe felt very comfortable selling into one administration, that changes when you've got a big shift. How do you guys think about companies and their responsibility to know how and where and police, for lack of a better term, how the tech gets used?
I totally agree that there are so many different ways that technology can be used maliciously in ways that their designers did not intend, could not have even dreamed up, etc. I think that there are ways as an investor and then also as a builder too that you can mitigate this. And part of it. Some of it is inherent in the technology itself, right? Like if you're building facial recognition tools, then the chance of potential misuse or abuse is high, right? Like they're inherent in the technology itself is a certain amount of risk. There are a lot of ways that a company can arm themselves to ensure that their tech is used responsibly. And part of that is making really thoughtful decisions about who you will and won't sell to. There's also lots of design decisions you can make in the creation of the product itself. And then there's also some governance decisions you can make too, right? You can write some of your values into your corporate charter, create an ethics advisory board up front, create a function internally that's entire role is like sort of risk scanning, across the horizon to sort of mitigate things as they come up. And that's something that we try to work very actively with companies to do and help them troubleshoot in real time. And we've had founders say, hey, I've been approached by XYZ customers. Like, how should I think about whether or not we sign a contract with them and how should we think about it? And we always appreciate that. Like, it is a genuine conversation and companies need to grow. And so we're always happy to be a thought partner in making those decisions. That's one of the it's a challenge of being a minority shareholder on the cap table is like, you can't always dictate these decisions, right? So you have to have an enormous amount of trust with the founding team that you are values aligned and you're on the same page.
Yeah. I think the piece I'd add to that though is like, for me as an investor, it also goes beyond the founding team because I think often, you can have a great core very aligned set of values, but you never know how that team is going to evolve. And the other thing is, as a company gets bigger, you just need more perspectives. I mean, this speaks probably also to the importance of building, companies that really also have diversity and inclusion at the forefront. Because the fact is, if you're considering, you're a cybersecurity company that's thinking about selling your product into government, if you don't have folks on your team that understand that context of how that is likely to be, either used or misused, then it's going to be very hard for you to make that correct decision. And so I think the other thing we really kind of push our portfolio companies to start thinking about this at very early stages is, who are the other types of experts, perspectives, sounding boards that I can bring around to help us vet some of these decisions, because some of them are just too big to be made by one person, one founder, or even a small team of founders. And I think, you're never going to get it always right, but your odds are much higher if you can ensure that you're surrounding yourself with, a set of perspectives that don't necessarily all align with where you started and where you're coming from.
Totally agree. And I also often look for founding teams that have, real lived experience of the problem they're trying to solve, either from a personal perspective or professional, right? Maybe in their last role, they had to deal with XYZ problem and they observed it over many years and now have a solution to solve it, right? But I look for that in part because, I think it's often very good for like customer empathy building and things like that and really understanding the market. But also because I think, especially in some of these trickier areas that are fraught with a lot of, ethical weight, if somebody has lived the consequences of some of the challenges they're trying to solve, they tend to be much more thoughtful and sensitive about what could go wrong. And if you don't have that perspective in the founding team, then I think you need to go out and get it as part of your part of your product development process, or as you sort of alluded to, Megan, expanding into a new market or something like that.
You guys are right. But I also, as the operator, I think there's a couple of things that I think about, like when you're building this technology. One, Kevin Kelly has this really great kind of view on futurism of technology, and he talks about how technology itself is neutral, right? So nuclear could be used for massive human expansion with energy, and it also can be used for the worst atrocities in humankind. The real question is, as the builder, what is the natural ramification if the vision actually succeeds? A lot of founders, especially young ones that I spend time with, oftentimes think about what the first move is, whether that's cybersecurity or whatever, and then think about an exit, not thinking about what does it mean if this becomes massively used in the world? And to me, one of the kind of great stewardship principles you have as a builder is, are you building the things that are actually moving the world towards a direction that's better, or are you building things that are moving the world to something that's neutral or negative?
I agree with everything you just said there, except that a lot of people like to say that technology is neutral, and I'm not convinced that it is.
I agree.
People love to say like, oh, the system is neutral. It's just how people use it that has some sort of moral valence. And I think more times than not, like, technology is really purpose built, and that purpose and what it's like, that is inherent in the technology itself, right? I mean, here's a very like easy example, but like a gun is a form of technology, right? And there are people who love to say like guns don't kill people kill people, etc. But like a gun is a pretty purpose-built form of technology, right? And I think to try to deny that or to try to act like it's neutral can lead to a lot of like intellectual gymnastics that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I also tend to think it is used as an excuse not to take some level of responsibility for like the havoc that gets wrought, right? I mean, kind of the easy example here probably is, Facebook or Meta and what social media has unleashed in the world, which, arguably at the beginning was like a great, fun, easy way to kind of keep up with what your friends are doing. And, now is being used by, governments to try and influence elections in other countries and manipulate people and divide us. And I don't know that it's as easy as saying, if you have a view to what it looks like at great scale, you're able to see that coming. I think a lot of it has to do with the people at the helm and how receptive they are to engaging other perspectives and, taking a broader suite of views that recognize that, the technology itself was built by people with a certain lens and a certain lived experience for a purpose. And that can, run wild once it's out in the world. And I don't think you're absolved of, as a builder, having some responsibility in how that product gets used just because your intentions were good and your worldview is that the good outweighs the bad, right?
Rockets can be used to go to Mars, or rockets can be used to throw enormous amount of missiles like that. The technology is neutral. Like the rocket technology is neutral. It's what do we, in your point, purpose build it for? And then how do we enable thoughtful debate, I think is actually the point. Humans are the ones that have the responsibility, not the technology. The technology is going to happen. AI is going to happen, right? Like it's just going to happen.
Right. But it's being built by people who are training it on data sets with their own, in many cases, like biases, right? And gaps and inconsistencies. And it's not, I mean, I disagree on that point. I think it's I think once we start getting into things that people are coding and developing and making choices about what goes in and what stays out, it's not neutral anymore.
I think it is fair to say that even regardless of whether the technology itself has a sort of like a moral valence or not, and whether or not it was purpose built, like it certainly can be used in good ways and in bad ways. I mean, this comes up a lot around privacy, right? Like the first thing that people often say is a counter argument for like why, encrypted communications or something like that is like, well, it can also be used by a terrorist group to organize or something like that. And that's absolutely true. And I think there is to some extent analysis that has to be done, which is like, okay, on net, do we think this is ultimately, a positive good for the world or not? Acknowledging the fact that there also are potentially risks and consequences that you might not like to see. And you kind of have to do a kind of risk benefit analysis in every case,
Well, maybe this kind of logically takes us to what maybe is the backstop in some respects and in some jurisdictions for this, which is kind of the role of policy and government, right? I mean, we're starting to see a lot more conversation about that in the AI example that we talked about earlier. I am not super optimistic that the best and the brightest of our generation are the ones necessarily sitting in Congress at the moment. But I'm curious, Zoe, you've spent a fair amount of time in that space. I only briefly dipped my toe in it, but like, are there people in government that you feel like really understand this stuff in a way that they can be trusted to be the backstop and to create some guardrails where the technology itself can't?
So I do think that there are some extremely talented and really sharp people, in different parts of government who do understand at a deep level. I don't know if they're all sitting in Congress. Yeah.
Most operators that I know on the technology side that are pushing the boundaries are not opposed to responsible regulation. Like the role of government should be safety of its people. And so responsible regulation is things like, making sure that nuclear, technology is not in the hands of everybody, or maybe, CRISPR technology that could maybe, print a bioweapon. Like there are responsible regulatory frameworks to do. And then there's cases where it's just regulatory capture. I think in the financial service space, it's really tricky here because a lot of what makes sort of financial services broken is you have centralized power, centralized authority, which is basically built on regulatory capture, that just a handful of big banks basically are systematically control kind of the entire system. On the other hand, you have the crypto space, which actually, for the most part in the US, wants responsible regulation. The number of good Bitcoin and crypto, entrepreneurs who are leaving the US because for too long, there hasn't been a clear regulatory framework. They're actually asking for it. They're saying, we want responsible regulation. We don't want you to close it off. But the government was quite responsible with the internet, which is, hey, the internet can be used for good. It can be used for bad. We're going to lightly regulate it. We're going to have a light touch, but we're going to have clear frameworks. Financial service is a really good example where I think there's a desire for not a heavy hand, but a light touch, and definitely not no hand because nobody knows. Zoe, how do you think about that as an investor? Because it's really even tricky as an operator to navigate that.
In the past, a lot of major technological breakthroughs were born secret, meaning they sort of emerged in classified settings, right? It was something that was built within DARPA or within, some part of the US government. The ability to even work on that type of technology required, massive barriers to entry, huge amounts of capital, et cetera. And so there was a very kind of controlled environment in which, technology developed. Nuclear is a good example of that, but lots of others as well. And what's so different about a lot of the big advances we're seeing today is that they are born open in the sense that, anybody can, play around with TensorFlow or some other AI tool, at home, right? And don't get me wrong, that's actually amazing for the innovation economy and amazing from the point of view of, really democratizing access to advanced tools. And so I think in general, like that's a good thing. But what it also means is that the ability for those tools to be abused or just sort of or to advance in a way that is reckless, et cetera, is also much, much higher. We often are thinking about, what is the regulatory environment and what are the ways in which it can potentially create tailwinds for certain companies and also headwinds. I think, there are some firms that truly do invest based on an expectation of a regulatory change or opportunity. I think generally we tend to not do that. I think even if you kind of know directionally where regulation or policy is headed, it's hard to predict the time frame, especially in Washington when the government's about to shut down every other week, et cetera. So, I don't like to make investment decisions off of that rely on there being regulatory change. But I think you have to keep that in mind, both as a potential obstacle, but also a source of opportunity, right? Like, I actually think part of what makes, investing in Web3 and crypto interesting is that we're seeing a really rapidly evolving regulatory environment, and that potentially will create some interesting opportunities. How do you think about it? No, I mean, both of you, you guys spend lots of time in this space.
I can take it from our perspective. Like, I think about it very similarly to you, I would say. We don't look at regulation or at companies where regulation makes or breaks them, but we certainly have a view on which way regulation is likely to go if, as you said, like the time frame looks pretty uncertain. And so we've backed a number of companies where I also think we've started to see, here's an example is we're investors in a business called Stride Health. Stride helps independent workers, non-benefited workers, gig workers find all kinds of insurance products. It helps them save. It helps them kind of, get the suite of services that you would often get through a company in our kind of traditional World War II era W-2 benefit system. And part of what really, got us excited to invest in that business was that we saw the size of that workforce and how quickly it was growing and how all the conversations that were starting to happen more at the state level, I'd say, than at the federal level, but around ensuring that those gig economy business models that provided people flexibility worked, but also ensured that people had, kind of a bottom line of safety and security and expectations and being treated fairly for their labor. And so I'd say that was a part of our thesis, although it wasn't the driver, but we felt like this was a company that was going to be really well positioned when those regulations started to take place to help inform them and to craft, as you alluded to, Jeremy, responsible regulation versus ideological regulation. And we saw some key kind of partners in a number of places that I think wanted to work on that with us.
What about downside risk in the regulatory side? So the interesting thing is we were talking earlier about, what are the cases where technology evolves to something bad? There's another version of that, which is the technology could evolve to something good, but then be sort of up against a regulatory problem. So one of the more interesting cases to me recently that's evolved is I'm in love with this documentary that recently came out about Bitcoin use at a peer-to-peer level with no internet in Cuba. And so what's so fascinating is you have a bunch of folks that are sitting in a highly controlled environment, I guess is the way I would say it. And there is now one of the fastest growing areas of Bitcoin is in a place where people need to do literal bartering to survive because the economic conditions are so unique. And so you might have a US-based company. There's a couple that I'm quite aware of right now that have self-sovereignty, hold their own keys, decentralized wallets in Bitcoin that allow for mixing so the government in Cuba can't see everything that's going on. And then you have regulatory things that are actually pushing on some of those companies to not allow that and are talking about shutting those companies down. So here's kind of an interesting case where the company's stated goal is actually to enable more freedom and independence in areas with authoritarian governments. But the regulatory environment may not actually allow it. And so you have a downside risk as an investor, even though you might have an upside opportunity as seeing technology advance, ethics and the way we want to see the world work. So how do you balance those as the investor?
I think when there's, sort of major potential downside due to a regulatory action, it can be hard to build conviction that that's like worth taking a risk on. And yet, and I say that even as somebody who's like in the venture world where you're like, that's your job is like to take some pretty big risks and pretty big swings. I mean, I'm not familiar with that example itself, but I think it's really fair that, the tornado cash indictments caused a massive chilling effect across a lot of innovation and in the space in the open source community. And I think that's a reality of like building in some of these really frontier tech spaces. I think one thing that I've found both like interesting and kind of perplexing in watching the crypto regulatory conversation play out is like, doesn't feel to me like it was preordained that somebody like, Senator Elizabeth Warren would be anti-crypto. Like if you actually think about, sort of disintermediating the big banks, giving individuals more control, et cetera. Like to me, it's like there could have been a different version of the universe in which like Elizabeth Warren was a massive degen, right? Like, am I wrong about that? Like, it's not clear to me. Like, that was the CFPB was like, the big banks are like hurting the little guy. We need to give power to the people, etc. And so I've always like wondered why that is. Like, why is it that it fell this way and that way, or versus that way? Could it have been a generational thing? But I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher. I mean, I agree. As somebody who got into this rabbit hole after the 2008 financial crisis and thought, hey, like maybe we need to dismantle the big banks. So the same person who was kind of running that now is up against the technology that's actually doing that is quite surprising. On the other hand, one of the things I'm most actually proud of in government right now is, I mean, I've been in space for a long time, and if you looked at this 5 or 10 years ago, you didn't have folks in sitting government who were actually trying to, push, especially on the financial services side, freedom technology, let's call it. Now you have a pretty good debate going on. And the thing that's quite interesting is it goes across political divides. Like left and right, there are people who are really pushing Gary Gensler and others actually to have responsible regulation, not draconian regulation. And there's actually quite a deep understanding, and quite a few of the aid workers who work with them are super up on why this matters, why it's good for technology, why it's aligned with democratic values. And so I would say that's a shift that's happened over the last 5 years. We didn't have half a government thinking about it, interested in it, open with it, even if we do have a few people that are head scratchers on the side of the aisle they're on.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the things that makes me more optimistic, that it's going to take us longer to get there, but that we actually will have, I think, some sort of sensible framework around crypto regulation. Because you do see sort of unlikely bedfellows working on it. I think the key tension, like as I see it, is beyond the ideological piece. And obviously any of these things can become politicized in a weird way where, you find the Elizabeth Warrens and folks like that sitting on the side of the aisle that you didn't necessarily expect. But I do think the consumer protection piece and the trade-off between individual freedom and ensuring that people have, transparency and access to enough information to make an informed, decision. That I think is kind of one of the key pieces that we need to solve. And, maybe the technology has gotten big enough and widespread enough at some point that, people have seen the rug pulls and, learned where some of the trouble zones are and who some of the bad actors are. But I think that's what drives some of, the flip-flopping we've seen, particularly at least on like the Democratic side, is yes to sort of individual access and reducing power of the banks, but also ensuring that, we don't have situations like we had earlier this year where people had all their money at SVB and suddenly, FDIC insurance didn't cover it. Like there's no FDIC product for crypto, right? And so I think that's the worry, is that you're going to have a number of people that are very, very exposed and don't fully understand the risk that they're taking because the companies are, either intentionally or unintentionally not being, not fully disclosing what they're doing with that cash.
part of the reason that I, have really liked working on freedom tech or, I would say agentic tech, is that it isn't partisan, right? That there's people who care about, advancing human agency, who come at it from a very progressive perspective and often are thinking about it through the lens of, privacy and civil liberties and human rights. And then there are also people who are coming to it from a real libertarian perspective and care a lot about digital sovereignty and personal privacy. And I have always thought that was great. I'm like, if these two groups that usually don't see eye to eye on a whole lot can agree that things like, digital rights, data ownership, privacy, agency matters, that feels like progress to me.
I love it. I love it. And we could talk about the regulatory side all day long, but in many ways that's like the guardrails and the defense. But a lot of what all three of us are doing are what's on the offense to actually kind of push things forward. Zoe, I'm curious, what are you seeing as somebody who's looking at a lot of deals at the frontier? What's interesting right now? What are cool use cases that you're seeing that are kind of on the offense?
Often I think about it through sort of the frame of both, kind of like defensive technologies that are trying to mitigate certain types of harm. So for example, like deepfake detection, I would put in that category. And then there's some that, I guess I often think of it as being more like proactive rather than offensive because it's not always adversarial, but like it's proactively about, sort of like protection of some of these values that we discussed. And, I think on both sides, I was going to say the proactive side, but I actually think it applies to both, particularly with the explosion of interest recently in AI and large language models, and ways in which like AI assistants and AI co-pilots might come to really play a major role in our lives. I think there's a real sort of outstanding macro question here, which is, is it going to be possible for users to own their own training data? And I mean sort of like your data exhaust on the internet, as well as things like, your likeness, your face, your voice, your biometrics, et cetera, which could be used to create a deepfake or whatever else, without your consent, at least right now. And so, I think some people would say it's too far gone, that type of world where we can own training data, like that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know. Like we're still, I think, in the early innings of a lot of this. And so I'm really interested in solutions that, are giving users an enormous amount of control, over first party data as it is used in the context of AI. So, I'll give an example. A while ago, we invested in a company called Anon.com, and they are focused on helping to manage, the sort of identity and credentials layer for AI co-pilots. It's an enterprise data infrastructure play in many ways, and yet the outcome is quite good for users because it should give users an enormous amount of control over first-party data. So I'm really interested in things like that right now. I will say, I'm also seeing a lot of interest in tools to give individuals control over their digital likeness. So finding ways to create a digital twin and then be able to, sort of license out your vocal tracks and things like that and earn royalties. I think that stuff is interesting. I'm going to be curious to see where it goes. But it's really the flip side of like, deepfake detection. It's like, okay, well, actually, if we can use your digital likeness to create something in the world, like let's help creators to help monetize that. So it's really, it's sort of like new frontiers in all directions. And I'm excited to see what people come up with.
This has been an amazing conversation. I think probably we could talk for many hours more about all of these topics. There are no easy answers, right? If there were, we would have solved everything by now. But Zoe, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your perspective. Thank you for all these like fun catchphrases we've kind of had emerge here between offensive tech and agentic tech and, what was it, internet exhaust or digital exhaust? I'm going to use that.
Well, Megan, I used to say anti-authoritarian tech because that felt like really specific and, whatever. And I found that it really didn't roll off the tongue for most people. And also it was kind of negative, which, we don't like. We'd rather think about like what it is we're building as opposed to what we're countering. So, yeah, but yes, thank you.
No, it's been absolutely a fantastic conversation. Thank you for coming on and chatting with us and sharing your experience. Where can people who are eager to learn more about you or learn more about Exante find you?
People can find me on Twitter at Z Weinberg, and they can follow the fund on a variety of different social accounts, but our website is buildexante.com.
Awesome. I love it, Zoe. We're super psyched you were here. Thanks for being here. I personally, this guy wearing the Bitcoin shirt right now, am fan of the anti-authoritarian tech, but this was an incredible show. I like the diversity of the conversation a ton. And so we really appreciate it. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks, Zoe.